Hello. What I want to talk about today is the trucker strikes and protests that took place in 1973 and 1974 regarding the oil embargo. I came across a very interesting article. It was actually on the History Channel website that kind of gave a little background to how it began, and it talked about a man named J.W. Edwards who was from Kansas. He was a truck driver, and one day he decided to stop his truck in the middle of the interstate and just kind of spew his frustrations with the prices of diesel and the government regulations that were going on. And so at that time, Edwards was roughly making about $12,000 a year. And with the diesel prices rising and with the consideration of the government to actually implement a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit on these long haul drivers like Edwards, this would have a huge impact on his income and it would leave him with little. Um, So upon stopping his truck, about an hour later, he saw, hundreds of trucks coming to a stop on the interstate alongside him. This left like 1,000 vehicles at a standstill on the interstate. This extended about 12 miles in both directions. Um, the next day, about 10 states saw these similar demonstrations, and one trucker actually made a comment saying that he didn't think Congress would do anything until people ran out of toilet paper, which hit a little too close to home with things that have been going on lately. Um, so the vast majority of these truck drivers were independent truck drivers, meaning they didn't work for some big company or anything like that. They were independent. They operated their own vehicles, and at this time, independents they hauled about 70% of the country's freight. That's according to the Interstate Commerce Commission estimates. Um, so these truckers began to organize, and they formed dozens of independent trucking associations. These protests continued into 1974, and actually on January 31st of 1974, trucks came to a halt. Uh, and these independent truck drivers, they either parked their trucks or they blockaded roads. And in some cases, these protests actually grew violent when there were instances of people throwing bricks off of overpasses onto moving vehicles that were going down the road, which is was pretty crazy. um, there was an agreement reached after these protests on February 7th of 1974 between lawmakers and a six-man team of truckers. This allowed the truck drivers to add a temporary 6% fuel surcharge to their freight fees, and it guaranteed that truck stops would get more fuel to meet their needs. Um, Eventually, actually, the feds began threatening to send in troops to get the truck drivers back on the road. And on February 11th, of 1974, most trucks got back on the road. And unfortunately, these strikes caused around 100,000 or so layoffs nationwide, several deaths, and nationwide food and gas shortages. Um, for the truck drivers, however, 1973 and 1974 changed everything for them. For the first time, the government began to recognize small independent truckers as a force instead of just dealing with these large trucking companies that they would deal with all the time because they had more of a voice than these independent drivers. And some of these independent truck drivers were not happy at all with the agreements that were made. Many of them were unhappy. They didn't want to get back on the road. They wanted to keep protesting and have more of their demands be met. But it was just something that they couldn't really come to an agreement on as far as giving them more of what they wanted. They had to come, meet in some middle ground there. And, groups like the OOIDA went on to play a critical role in helping shape rules and regulations. There was like fighting corrupt truck inspection as well as lobbying to repeal the national maximum speed limit that was being implemented. So uh, this would actually, unfortunately, not be the last time that the public would see these displays of protests by truckers. And a few years later, it got even worse, and more violent protests came. They came to the interstates again, and some of these were more violent, and they just wanted their voices to be heard, and they wanted more of their demands to be met. And actually, this is, I think, one of the largest driving forces to the kind of the skepticism of federal government and like the role that it should be playing in the economy. And I think it really led to like this movement of deregulation in the economy and this movement towards freedom in the market that we kind of saw in the 1980s. And so I just thought this was really interesting. And I actually think a lot of it is kind of relatable to what's going on right now. A lot of this uncertainty that we're seeing and they saw then, I think really hits home a lot right now, because I think we're seeing a lot of these same, not the same things, but necessarily, but a lot of the same kind of feelings towards certain things. Some people are uncertain. Some people just don't really know what to expect right now. And I think, like the 70s and 80s, I think we're going to come out with some sort of newfound attitude towards government and the economy as a whole.